Most people think they understand how poverty worked in the past. They imagine scarcity, certainly empty cupboards, thin clothing, long winters, but they also assume a kind of moral clarity. If someone was punished, the thinking goes, it was because they had done something clearly wrong. Theft was theft. Crime was crime. Law, however harsh, at least drew a recognizable line. That belief feels reasonable. It matches how we are taught to think about law, as a response to behavior, not condition. People break rules. Institutions respond. Poverty may explain desperation, but it does not, in this view, redefine innocence. The problem is that this understanding is incomplete. In many historical societies, the poor were not simply more likely to commit crimes. They were more likely to be defined as criminals, often without changing their behavior at all. The same act could be invisible when performed by one person and punishable when performed by another. Not because the act differed, but because the status of the person did. This is usually explained away with a simple idea. Harsh times required harsh rules. Survival demanded order. Authorities cracked down because they had no choice. But that explanation leaves something unresolved. If the goal was order, why were so many punishments aimed not at violence or disruption, but at ordinary survival itself? Why were so many crimes quiet, repetitive, and non-confrontational, walking, gathering, sleeping, working without permission? Why did enforcement concentrate not where harm was greatest, but where poverty was most visible? These are not questions about cruelty or compassion. They're questions about structure. Because when you look closely at historical court records, local ordinances, and everyday enforcement, a pattern appears that is difficult to reconcile with the idea of law as a neutral referee. The poor were not only punished when they transgressed, they were punished for existing in the wrong way, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. This was rarely framed as persecution. It was framed as management. Authorities did not say they were criminalizing poverty. They said they were regulating behavior. They said they were protecting resources, stabilizing labor, preserving order. Each rule, taken alone, sounded reasonable. Often, it was reasonable. The unsettling question is not why harsh laws existed. It is why so many of them only made sense once you assume that poverty itself was the problem being controlled. If that assumption is correct, then what looks like punishment for crime begins to resemble something else entirely, an everyday system in which survival slowly crossed an invisible legal line, and staying alive required constant negotiation with the law. To understand how poverty slipped into criminality, it helps to step backward away from courtrooms and punishments, and look instead at how everyday life was organized. Most pre-industrial societies depended on stability more than growth. Land, food, and labor were finite. Predictability mattered. A person was expected to belong somewhere, to a household, a parish, a guild, an employer. Belonging was not an abstract identity. It was an administrative fact. Someone accounted for you. This is where a misunderstanding begins. We often think of poverty as simply having less. Historically, poverty also meant being unaccounted for. A person without steady work, fixed residence, or recognized dependency did not fit cleanly into the system that distributed food, work, and responsibility. They were not outside society, but they were loosely attached to it. Authorities did not initially respond with punishment. They responded with categorization. People were sorted. The deserving poor, who were old, injured, widowed, and the able-bodied, who theoretically could work. This distinction sounds charitable, even pragmatic. Resources were limited. Priorities had to be set. But the distinction carried an implicit assumption that poverty without visible incapacity signaled choice, avoidance, or disorder. Think of it less like a moral judgment and more like a logistical one. A system designed to allocate labor cannot easily tolerate people who are present, but idle, mobile, but unaffiliated. From the system's perspective, such people resemble errors. Not dangerous, necessarily, but unpredictable. So rules emerged to reduce that unpredictability. Movement required permission. Work required registration. Begging required proof. Sleeping in the wrong place became an offense not because it harmed anyone, but because it indicated a person operating outside approved channels. The issue was not what the poor were doing, but that they were doing it without being legible to authority. This is why so many early crimes of poverty feel oddly bureaucratic. They read less like prohibitions against harm and more like failed paperwork. No license, no master, no settlement, no authorization. At the time, these measures were not seen as extreme. They were framed as maintenance. Just as granaries were monitored and markets regulated, people were managed to prevent strain on local resources. The crucial shift happens here. Once survival activities seeking food, moving to find work, asking for help were filtered through regulatory systems. Non-compliance became indistinguishable from wrongdoing, not because survival was immoral, but because it bypassed control. Poverty did not suddenly become criminal. It became administratively inconvenient. And systems tend to respond to inconvenience not with empathy, but with enforcement. Once poverty was framed as a problem of management, regulation did not arrive all at once. It accumulated. Each rule addressed a narrow concern. None announced a broad intent to punish the poor. In fact, many were presented as solutions, ways to restore order, protect communities, or encourage productive behavior. The system expanded not through cruelty, but through repetition. Consider how incentives aligned. Local authorities were responsible for maintaining roads, feeding the destitute, and preventing unrest, often with limited funds. Every newcomer represented potential cost. Every unemployed person represented uncertainty. So laws increasingly tied responsibility to locality. A person belonged to a parish, town, or estate, and that place was financially accountable for them. This created a predictable response. If you could restrict who officially belonged, you could restrict who required support. Settlement laws, residency requirements, and proof of origin rules were not about movement in the abstract. They were about budgets. A poor person without documentation was not just inconvenient, they were a liability no one wanted to claim. The result was a feedback loop. To avoid responsibility, communities tightened rules. As rules tightened, more people fell outside them. As more people fell outside, enforcement intensified not because disorder increased, but because exclusion did. At the same time, labor markets were changing. Seasonal work, enclosure, and early wage labor produced cycles of employment and unemployment that no longer matched older expectations of permanent service. People moved more, worked intermittently, and relied on informal arrangements to survive. But the legal framework did not adjust. Instead, it treated this new instability as defiance. Laws against vagrancy, loitering, and idleness expanded, even as stable work became harder to secure. A person actively seeking work could still be punished for not currently having it. The law measured status, not effort. This is how ordinary behavior crossed into illegality. Walking without a destination, staying too long in one place without employment, working outside licensed trades, accepting informal help. None of these were inherently disruptive, but each signaled participation in the economy without permission. The system normalized this quietly. Officials enforced rules because enforcement was expected. Magistrates applied penalties because precedent existed. Employers benefited from constrained labor mobility. Property holders supported measures that reduced visible poverty. No single group needed to intend harm for harm to occur. What emerged was not a conspiracy, but an equilibrium, a stable arrangement in which the costs of poverty were pushed downward and outward onto those least able to absorb them, while the structure itself appeared orderly, legal, and necessary. By the time punishments became visibly harsh, the groundwork had already been laid. The question was no longer whether survival could be criminalized. It was how far that logic could be extended before its consequences became impossible to ignore. There is a point in every system where accumulation turns into exposure. For centuries, the regulation of poverty operated mostly at the margins. Quiet fines, short detentions, forced returns, warnings recorded and forgotten. The machinery was present, but it did not always draw attention to itself. It simply redirected people back to parishes, into service, out of sight. Then conditions changed. Population growth, food shortages, war, and economic disruption placed sustained pressure on systems designed for stability, not volume. The number of people living close to subsistence increased, while the capacity to absorb them did not. The gap between expectation and reality widened. Authorities responded predictably. They did not dismantle the framework. They intensified it. Enforcement became more regular. Penalties became more standardized. What had once been discretionary turned procedural. A person arrested for vagrancy might be whipped, branded, imprisoned, or transported, not because their behavior had escalated, but because the system now required visible deterrence to remain credible. This is often described as a moral hardening, a loss of compassion, but the records suggest something colder. Officials were less concerned with reforming individuals than with signaling control. Public punishment served an administrative function. It demonstrated that rules still applied, even when they were increasingly difficult to obey. Visibility compensated for ineffectiveness. Workhouses and houses of correction illustrate this shift. They were not designed primarily as sites of aid. They were designed as filters. Entry required proof of destitution, exit required compliance. Relief became conditional on confinement, labor, and surveillance. The message was consistent. Assistance was available, but only in forms that removed autonomy. For many, this presented a false choice: accept institutional control or risk criminal penalties for surviving independently. Begging without authorization led to arrest. Sleeping outside designated spaces led to removal. Moving to find work led to expulsion. Each path narrowed into the same outcome. What makes this moment significant is not the severity of punishment, but its predictability. Once survival strategies were criminalized in principle, enforcement no longer depended on intent or harm. It depended on visibility. Those who could blend in, attach themselves to households, or secure temporary protection often avoided punishment. Those who could not were processed. The system did not ask why poverty had expanded. It asked how efficiently it could be contained. By the time public discomfort emerged, when prisons filled, punishments escalated, and social tension rose, the structure was already entrenched. Reform threatened not just laws, but the assumptions beneath them. The consequences were no longer theoretical. They were lived daily and increasingly difficult to deny. By the final stage, the system no longer needed to justify itself. Poverty had been translated into categories, filtered through rules, and enforced through routine. What remained was not a series of harsh decisions, but a stable outcome that reproduced itself without much instruction. People entered it simply by failing to meet expectations that were no longer realistic. The poor learned this quickly. They learned which behaviors drew attention and which delayed it. They learned to keep moving or to stay invisible. They learned that compliance did not guarantee safety, only temporary reprieve. A warning could become a record. A record could become proof. Proof could become punishment. At this point, criminality no longer described actions. It described trajectories. Once someone was marked, returned to a parish, confined to a workhouse, listed as idle, it became harder to re-enter legitimacy. Time spent imprisoned disrupted work. Forced relocation severed social ties. Public punishment reduced trust. Each corrective measure reduced the likelihood of compliance the next time. The system responded not by reconsidering its assumptions, but by escalating its controls. More surveillance, more documentation, more penalties for repeat offenses. Recidivism was interpreted as moral failure rather than structural inevitability. The fact that the same people cycled through the same punishments was taken as confirmation that enforcement was necessary, not that it was misaligned. This is the pattern that repeats across history. Not because institutions are cruel, but because systems tend to protect their own logic. Once poverty is defined as deviation, evidence of poverty becomes evidence of guilt. The line between cause and effect collapses. From the outside, it eventually looks irrational. Why punish people for being unable to comply with rules that assume stability? Why invest so much effort in containment rather than prevention? Why accept outcomes that are expensive, visible, and destabilizing? The answer is uncomfortable in its simplicity, because by that stage, changing the system would require admitting that the problem was never individual behavior at all. It would require acknowledging that reasonable rules, applied consistently, had produced unreasonable results. So the system endured, not unchanged, but recognizable. Laws softened, language evolved, institutions were renamed. Yet the core mechanism tying legitimacy to compliance with structures that scarcity makes difficult to satisfy persisted. Looking back, it is tempting to frame this as a failure of empathy. It is more accurate to see it as a failure of imagination. A system built to manage order could not easily conceive of poverty except as disorder. And once that premise was accepted, the outcome followed with quiet certainty, not as a moral lesson, as a predictable result.